Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. Here with my co-host, Sean Kennedy. And we have a great episode today, Sean. We got a very in-depth interview with Dennis Spaulding. Dennis is one of the four officers that we call the East Haven Four. These are four former East Haven, Connecticut police officers who were charged and convicted of, federal crimes in federal court during the Obama administration. And really, when you put scrutiny on the case, they actually really didn't do anything. They were scapegoats of the Obama administration's Justice Department and wound up losing everything, their careers, their pensions, their freedom. And we're working with them to hopefully secure a presidential pardon. But this interview with Dennis is just incredible. In fact, there's so much to it, we had to split it across 2 episodes.
The thing that really strikes you is the vindictiveness of the federal authorities, the Obama Justice Department, where they didn't get the scalps they wanted in the way they wanted, so they punished these cops. And we often talk about injustices in the system where people don't get justice. But in this case, this is injustice the other way. Somebody was wrongfully convicted. Actually, 4 of these officers were wrongfully convicted, as you said, as scapegoats. And really, it all boils down to the vindictiveness of the Justice Department under Obama, and it ruined lives. And it's a tragedy, and it does need to be rectified, even for history's sake.
I mean, this would be the 3rd incident in the last few years at the LELDF where we've had a federal case in which a law enforcement officer or law enforcement officers, plural, were convicted of federal crimes where when we really looked into it, it was completely bogus. It was like the whole investigation started just with a desire to charge a law enforcement officer with a crime. That's where it started. And then the person who was going to be charged was identified. And then the case was built. And, the federal criminal justice system is tough. And Dennis kind of goes into that in some of the ways when you really look into the details. These are just guys that are doing their job. They weren't corrupt. They were actually decorated cops, just doing their jobs. And till their world came crashing down, and we can never take back what happened to them. Dennis gets into all of the things that happened to them. But we're working really hard to clean the slate and really appealing to President Trump to help us do that. So, great interview. This will be part 1 today, and then we'll have the second segment from the interview in our next episode. So sit back and enjoy. It's very interesting. Dennis Spaulding, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate everything you guys do for the law enforcement community.
You served as an East Haven, Connecticut police officer. How many years did you serve?
Approximately 9 years before I ended up being forced to retire.
So 9 years, not a rookie. That's a pretty, by the time you get to your 9th year, you know what you're doing, right?
Yeah. Yes.
What kind of, obviously you were a patrol officer for at least part of that time, but what other duties did you have during your police career?
Mostly just patrolling neighborhoods, but you picked up special assignments where you would do DWI checkpoints. You would, be hired to do security at hockey and different events at bars, direct traffic for overtime, things like that.
Yeah. East Haven is a pretty small town, right?
The population's about 30,000 people.
Okay. And how many police officers, at least at that time, did they have?
We have around 50. And I believe the numbers are still pretty current.
Okay. So it's a relatively small department. Most law enforcement agencies in America are relatively small departments. And East Haven sounds like a pretty good town to live in, right? I mean, it's a pretty good place.
Yeah, it's a beautiful town. People are amazing there. I grew up there. I raised my children early on in the town, and just a beautiful place to grow up in and raise a family in.
And what attracted you to become a police officer, particularly in East Haven?
When I grew up in that town, it gave me so much opportunity in my life that I wanted to give back and protect and serve the community that I grew up in and get to serve the community and everyone that I knew and I grew up with.
Did you like being a police officer?
I loved it.
I'm going to focus now on the years, 2008, 2009, 2010. That's really going to kind of get into what led ultimately to you being prosecuted in federal court and going to federal prison.
So around that time, right next door to East Haven is the city of New Haven, Connecticut. At the time, they were starting to become a sanctuary city. They were putting into place a lot of immigrant-friendly policies. They were giving identification cards. They were one of the first in the country to give municipal identification cards to illegal immigrants or any member of the community that needed identification. But mostly it was for the illegal immigration population that didn't have any form of identification. So this was drawing in a huge amount of undocumented immigrants to the area. So during my patrols as a police officer, we started to notice large amounts of out-of-state license plates.
Any particular states?
At the time, there was a Tennessee plate, and the New Haven police did a huge investigation. I believe the FBI was involved, and they ended up canceling and suspending and finding out that this was a major fraud, helping illegal immigrants get registration plates via the state of Tennessee, and they were using them in Connecticut just because Connecticut did not allow illegal immigrants to get license plates. You weren't allowed to get a driver's license.
Let me just stop you right there, because it's important, I think, as we tell the story, to understand what exactly was going on. Because I think for people who haven't worked in law enforcement, sometimes it just kind of escapes you, these dynamics about registration plates. Because in most states, getting a registration plate is involved. You have to have a driver's license. You have to show that you are a resident of that state. Some states you have to show that the car has been inspected. You have to pay taxes in some states anyway, in order to get the plate. So this particular scheme or scam of fake registration plates is just particularly appealing to people who are new in the United States and can't do any of that. They can't get the car inspected. They can't get a driver's license. They maybe can't pay the tax to get the car registered or the registration fees. So this is an alternative way of doing it. Am I pretty accurate on that?
Correct.
Okay.
Connecticut, you needed to be a U.S. citizen or have lawful status in the United States to get a registration plate. And at the time, a lot of states required that. Same with driver's license. So they were using sort of a middleman who was forging documents that had connections to Department of Motor Vehicle. And they were, it was a whole scheme where they would mail these plates and that, large sums of money were being handed off to the criminals involved in this scam.
You start seeing a lot of this in East Haven, mostly connected, you think, it sounds like you're right, with people in the country illegally, but we're mostly in and around New Haven, which is right next to East Haven. So they're traveling in and around East Haven. You're an East Haven police officer. You and your colleagues notice this. You understand that it's again, not only is it illegal, but if you don't have valid registration plates, it also means you don't have what? You don't have car insurance. So if you get involved in an accident, whoever you hit isn't going to be compensated for that. And and you don't necessarily have a driver's license either. So you and other East Haven police officers take it on yourselves to start looking into this illegal activity. And that's where this whole thing kicks off, right?
Correct. So when we move into the Pennsylvania license plates, we come to find out that there was over 1,500 plates involved in this large scale organized crime involving thousands of illegal immigrants and a person in Philadelphia who was the mastermind behind this whole scam. She and a partner ended up being arrested by the state police in Pennsylvania. Turns out that they were sending the registration plates, fake insurance cards, and then they were charging approximately $1,500 for these plates. And I believe at the end of the investigation, there was over 1,500 plates canceled as part of this scam.
So 1,500 times 1,500 adds up.
Multi-million-dollar scam. And then on top of this, the major issue is that the states and towns were losing out on millions of dollars with this crime. In Connecticut, you pay property tax on your vehicle. So if it is not registered to the town where your vehicle's in, you do not pay property tax on it. So towns in Connecticut were losing out on millions of dollars in property tax because of this organized scam.
So you and some of your colleagues, your fellow officers in East Haven were actively involved in enforcing the law. And I don't think anybody, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone has made any claim that what was going on here with these fake tags was not against the law. I think you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone agrees it is a violation of the law.
No, but there were groups that did not want us enforcing this law. They wanted us to ignore it simply because illegal immigrants could not get a driver's license and registration in Connecticut.
So they say it is against the law, but it's a law that you shouldn't enforce.
Correct. They wanted us to ignore it.
As a law enforcement officer, and you took an oath, and once upon a time I did too, do you have the ability to decide for yourself which laws you want to enforce and which ones you don't?
No. It's our oath of duty to enforce the laws.
Enforce the law.
And ignoring the law is not an option for us.
So you're doing this. You're very active in it. I've looked into your background. You're a well-respected police officer, and then there are 3 other officers that were involved in this with you along the way. So it's not just you. When did you first become aware that what you were doing was under the scrutiny of the federal government?
So it started when Yale Law School and an activist priest started coming into town and protesting basically what we were doing. They thought it was discriminatory towards Hispanics. They said we were targeting the Hispanic population. They said we were harassing them. So once Yale Law School starts getting involved, they start filing complaints and protests and showing up on our traffic stops, just trying to make life miserable for us and our department for what we're doing.
Trying to interfere with the enforcement of the law, basically.
Yeah, they didn't want us to enforce it. So they started gathering some of the people that we had arrested for this fraud, and they had put together a lawsuit. They've also filed multiple complaints to the Department of Justice asking them to investigate our department and our officers involving this investigation that we were conducting. And based on the amount of arrests that we were making, they were claiming that we were targeting Hispanics.
Did your department or the leadership of your department or the leadership of the city, did anyone try to discourage you from inside to not do this anymore or to not enforce the law in this area?
No, everyone was aware of how big this fraud was. The mayor's office, the police chief, the prosecutors, they were aggressively prosecuting the criminals that were involved in this, with most of the arrests ending in a guilty plea. The mayor of the town, she was a Democrat at the time, she put out a campaign flyer talking about all the out-of-state license plates and how she and her administration cracked down on them. I mean, she didn't have much to do with it was the individual officers.
She was in charge of the city at the time.
So she was taking credit for the crackdown on which she described as tax cheats with out-of-state license plates.
But it strikes me as a whole lot more than tax cheats. It's a public safety risk because you've got a bunch of unlicensed, uninsured drivers on your roads. I mean, to me, that's the kind of the biggest thing. But
correct. In the city of New Haven, they put out a memo stating that over 22% of all accidents during this time period when this fraud was occurring resulted in a hit-and-run accident where the drivers would be involved and they would take off. And through the arrest and location of some of these people that had fled from the scene, the majority of them were undocumented, unlicensed, and uninsured drivers.
Okay. So at some point, because, so there's the involvement of there's a activist priest, Father Manship.
Correct.
And he got engaged in this. And then someone got Yale Law School, like a clinic in Yale's law school involved. And so it's getting the attention of advocate, pro-immigration and in some cases, anti-police activists. At some point, the federal government overtly reaches out to the city, right, through the Department of Justice.
Yes, they said they wanted to open up a pattern and practice investigation into the town. Previously, before that, there was an FBI year-long investigation into the allegations that were raised by
How was that resolved? The FBI is involved. They open an investigation. The allegation is that there's unlawful activity by the police department, specifically, racial profiling, I think was the allegation.
Correct.
And so the FBI opens an investigation. They bring in undercover special agents.
Yes.
And you'll tell the story better than I can ask the question, but undercover special agents come in and who appear to be Hispanic.
Correct.
Because they're trying to test whether, you will whether they'll be targeted. But they're driving cars that are properly registered, right? Because they're the FBI.
Correct. They can't violate the law. So they were driving around town with Hispanics from their 302, which is an FBI report on their activity. The case agent says that they drove around with Hispanics in the vehicle with Hispanic-looking agents. They drove around town numerous times over a 1-year period trying to get pulled over, intentionally driving in front of police officers, driving around town, just making themselves aware to the police. And they were never pulled over in the entire time.
And so the FBI eventually, after, I think, a year, of an investigation.
Correct.
Eventually closes their investigation and doesn't take any action because they're like, we can't even get pulled over. I don't think they're profiling. I'm paraphrasing, but is that what happened?
Pretty much. They looked into the racial profiling aspect and civil rights violations that Yale Law School had brought up, and they ended their investigation with no criminal recommendation, no criminal charges recommended, no finding of any wrongdoing by the police department, and the case agent said the case went stale, and he destroyed a approximately 1-inch thick case file that could have included important documents that would have helped us later on in the criminal trial.
Does that seem normal to you that the FBI would build a case file and then later destroy it?
I've never heard of that, and that would be obviously an obstruction of justice if that was done intentionally.
Never heard of that either. So that happens, but also the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division approaches the city and wants to open this pattern or practice investigation. And that's just for listeners, that's a civil investigation that could result in a consent decree. That was at the time under the Obama administration, that was kind of the playbook. If they suspect some state or local police department was involved in something that they would say is unlawful, that's their move, is they go in, they do a civil investigation, and it results in a consent decree. So they tried that, and the city said what?
Correct. So they came into town. They were fully made the town aware that they were coming in to open a pattern and practice investigation into claims of racial profiling by the police department. There was strong pushback from the town and the police department and police union because they questioned the validity of this investigation and the possible political aspect of it.
So they come in, they want to do a pattern or practice investigation. They told the leadership of the city that's what they intended to do. What was the city's reaction to that?
So the city pushed back against the civil litigation. They questioned the validity of it. So they were not going to cooperate. The town and the police department were not going to cooperate. The civil side basically backed out of the town when they found out that we were not going to cooperate and that we did not agree with the consent decree or the pattern of practice investigation. The town strongly objected that there was anything wrong or criminal going on in our town because they had investigated numerous claims.
So, but when the DOJ Civil Rights Division comes into town and proposes a pattern or practice investigation, that's not something that they ask you about, right? That's just the city's leadership that makes a decision on it. I mean, you may agree with their decision, but that's not your decision, right?
No.
You're a patrol officer, so you're just doing your job. So the city rebuffs the DOJ's efforts. And it's important to note that just because we got to kind of put all the players on the board here, is that at this time, Barack Obama is the president.
Correct.
Who is the attorney general? It was Eric Holder, right?
Correct.
Okay. So Eric Holder was the attorney general for most of the Obama administration. And a guy named Tom, this is kind of like this name will come up in the future during this interview, is Tom Perez was the head of the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ at the time.
Yes.
Okay. Now, for listeners, later, Tom Perez became a member of the Obama cabinet. He was a Secretary of Labor, and then he was the head of the Democrat National Committee for some years during the first Trump administration. So Tom Perez is a guy who was very politically motivated, up and comer at the time. He is the one who is kind of leading the charge here, would you say, in this case? Okay. So because this town rebuffed them, what was their next move? What did they do next?
So it seemed like the civil litigation side backed out of town. We didn't hear anything for a few weeks. Then all of a sudden, they sent the FBI to every one of our police officers' house. Every single police officer got an early morning knock on their door wanting to look into civil rights violations, any information about racial profiling within the department. And so now we feel in the department that this was turned into a criminal investigation and we were going to be used as pawns because the town did not cooperate with the civil litigation side.
So federal law enforcement goes around and in the morning knocks on the door of every East Haven police officer. Is that right?
Yes.
And so you got one of those knocks too, right?
I did.
And what did they want you to do? They wanted you to submit to an interview? Is that what the actual request was?
They did. They wanted to interview me about the racial profiling accusations that were going on.
And it wasn't specific to you at the time. It was just they had these allegations. It's almost like they didn't know where to start. They weren't given access to the city's records or anything like that. So they figured, well, we'll just knock on every police officer's door.
Correct.
I can tell you that I was a police officer for over 20 years and I never got a knock at my door. I'm not sure how I would have reacted if I did. Okay. So So then everyone knows. At that point, you know that everyone has a target on their back. I mean, I'm not, you haven't said this, but I'm saying it. It looks like every East Haven police officer, they're looking for someone that they can charge with a crime.
They came into town not to investigate a crime, but to find a crime to charge someone with. And we all knew that.
And so how long was it between that knock at the door and when you found out that you were actually one of the targets, that they had found what they were looking for, at least in their mind, and that you were in the crosshairs?
So from my memory, I don't ever remember being identified as a target. I remember that the entire department was at risk of being indicted or charged with crimes. I remember every single police officer fighting to find an attorney. At the time in the area, they were running out of competent attorneys, and some officers had to double up and use the same attorney, but they had to get court permission to make sure that there wasn't a conflict with representing these two separate police officers. There was rumors that they were trying to indict up to 25 people at the police department based on the complaint on the civil case, that there was 25 officers named in the civil case.
So at the time, did you have any idea that your enforcement of the law around these fake fraudulent registrations had anything like, did you make any connection between that and this federal investigation?
I knew because of this massive fraud that we uncovered and were enforcing and making massive amounts of arrests of undocumented immigrants that I was going to be targeted.
Yeah.
I was told by a local prosecutor when I ran by how I was enforcing the law and what I was doing that I better be careful because I'm going to have a target on my back. And he told me that. And at the time, I was a young police officer, and it really didn't hit home to me what that meant. In my head, I was doing everything right, and I was trying to protect my community. And so I really didn't understand who he was talking about when he said they would have a target on your back.
I was also once a young police officer, so I can kind of identify with that, where you don't really think in political terms as a police officer. I mean, most don't anyway. You're not analyzing everything you do like a politician would do. You're trained to enforce the law. You know what the law says. You follow, in some cases, a direction from your leaders, in some cases from prosecutors, but you understand this is the law you're enforcing, that you are enforcing against people who actually are violating the law. You're not thinking about, oh, well, this presidential administration is looking for a scapegoat here that they can hold out and say, look what we're doing. You're not thinking in those terms, right?
Correct. We were investigating, charging a crime. We were not making arrests based off people's race. We were investigating a crime. It was the crime that was charged, not the color of someone's skin.
Now, even though that is the case, at some point you found out that you actually had yourself been charged with a crime.
Yes.
How did you find that out?
They had been doing grand jury investigation for months. So everyone in the police department was talking about what was going on in the grand jury. The feeling amongst officers that this was turning political. Tom Perez was not leaving East Haven without charging someone for something.
And so did you get a call from your attorney, law enforcement, like the FBI show up at your house one day? Like, how did you actually become aware that you had been, ultimately you were indicted, right?
Correct. So even though we knew this was going on, we had been dealing with this and allegations and investigations for over a year and a half. The FBI sent teams of agents to our house in the middle of the night to arrest us. 2 of our officers were arrested at the police department in uniform with their guns, and one of them was a canine officer. That, to me, as a law enforcement officer, is the most ridiculous, dangerous thing that they could do. We have been cooperating. Our town and officers had been cooperating the entire time with the investigation. There was no need to make such a dangerous situation for everyone involved. We would have self-surrendered like 90% of the criminals that are indicted after lengthy investigations are afforded that opportunity to do. We knew they were trying to make a spectacle out of this.
Yeah, that's pretty apparent.
To that point, did they bring the media? Was there a perp walk? Was the local media aware of these arrests, and did you show up on the 6:00 news?
The local media was aware at the courthouse, and they saw us walking in and out. So they were notified ahead of time. Tom Perez was also in town waiting that night for a press conference that he did in the city of New Haven about our indictment.
So you were all, so it's you and three other, and who are the other three officers? We're just kind of referencing them generally, but who are the other three officers that you went through this with?
Canine Officer David Cari, Police Sergeant John Miller, and Jason Zullo, who is a member of the SWAT team for the town of East Haven.
And these are colleagues of yours. These are officers that you worked with.
The best.
Sergeant Miller was your supervisor, right?
Yes.
And I've of course I've come to look into their backgrounds, and you're all top flight law enforcement officers. You're all decorated, lots of medals, awards. You know, Dave Cari was shot in the line of duty. You know, you guys are really
John Miller saved 2 police officers' lives.
Yeah.
He had used deadly force twice. 2 police officers were shot by a robbery suspect before John Miller dispatched his weapon and killed the suspect before he can kill a police officer.
You won't. Most cops are fairly modest, so they won't say that about themselves. But I'm glad you highlighted your colleagues' accomplishments, awards, bravery, valor, service to the community, and your own. You know, you're modest about your own, but you were doing the same stuff. But Tom Perez comes to town. They do an investigation and they start charging cops. What were you? Just speaking about your case, what were you charged with?
I was charged with a 4-year-long criminal conspiracy to violate the civil rights of various members of the East Haven community.
Did you ever conspire to violate anyone's rights?
No.
How long had you been an officer at the point when the conspiracy began?
I believe they said 2008 this conspiracy began. Basically, it aligns with the license plate investigation.
But how long have you been
at the time, that would have been my 3rd year on the job.
So 3 years in, you decide to launch this massive 4-year-long conspiracy to violate the civil rights of residents of East Haven.
Yes. And to this day, I have a spotless record at the police department. I have a clean disciplinary record, not even a written warning.
Yeah, but the federal government thinks you're a rogue.
Yep.
What was the underlying conspiracy? So they alleged that you were involved in this conspiracy. What was the overt act that supported the conspiracy, according to them?
I don't even know. They put in random civilian complaints over the 4 years that are general disgruntled civilians about enforcement taking against them or arguments they had with police officers.
But it wasn't because you used excessive force.
Not in the conspiracy. That was one of the charging crimes.
Okay. What was that? What was the alleged excessive force? What was that all about?
So I was arresting a driver in the parking lot of one of our very problematic bars. And the driver was an illegal immigrant, no license, no registration, insurance. And during the course of this, the owner, who again, police officers were starting to be confronted more and more during these traffic stops. He came out and he wanted to argue basically about me getting off his property and I have no right to do this. Why are you arresting all the Hispanics? You know, everybody has no driver's license. It's not their fault. They can't get one. Basically, a lot of his customers were being arrested because his business catered to the undocumented population in the area. So he ended up being arrested after several warnings to not interfere with my traffic stop. He was arrested for interfering with a police officer and breach of peace. However, he had told the U.S. attorney that I had beat him, kicked him 30 to 40 times. He thought he was never going to walk again, is what he said at trial. Well, come to find out, he doesn't know that we have a copy of his medical report. And the only force I used from him is when he pulled away from me, I grabbed his arm into an arm bar and did a leg sweep, and it caused a small cut on his chin. So after he made all these allegations that he was beat, he thought he was never going to walk again. He told the jury he thought his jaw was broken. Well, at trial, it comes out that we have the medical report. And in the medical report, it says patient was pushed to the ground, was not punched, was not kicked. He was treated for a 2-centimeter cut on his chin, which I agree I did when I did the arm bar and took him to the ground when he was resisting arrest. So
basically, you use reasonable force to make an arrest of a person who was interfering with your duties as a police officer, obstructing.
Correct.
And so minor injury, but you didn't like brutalize him, beat him up. He wasn't seriously injured, but that was the basis for some federal prosecution.
That was the most serious crime against me, was the 2-centimeter cut. However, at trial, like I said, he said that he was beat, kicked, God knows how many times, dozens of times, all the injuries he had stated. Well, the U.S. attorney had never actually read the medical report. She just pointed out to the jury that the doctor or the physician's assistant had documented that it was an assault. And basically that's anytime another person uses force on another person, they classify it as assault.
The physician assistants did do an investigation.
So the U.S. attorney at trial had pointed that out to the jury, but I had already, I know what happened during that night, and I knew it wasn't true. So I really dug into this medical report to back up what my police report was saying. So in the report, patient was pushed to the ground, was not punched, was not kicked. He was given ibuprofen and treated for a 2-centimeter cut on his chin. That was what my excessive force involved. The U.S. attorney now knows or has a strong feeling that her witness lied about the use of force. However, she convinces the jury if the arrest of him was illegal, if you find the arrest of him to be illegal, any use of force would be excessive by the police officer. So now she knows her witness lied, wasn't truthful, and now she's still convincing the jury that they can still find me guilty of excessive force, despite everything not lining up.
Was there, that was back in the days before body-worn cameras were widely used. You didn't have there was no other, it was basically your word against the guy that you arrested's word, right? Is that kind of what it boils down to?
Correct. There was his brother on the scene. And during the grand jury, he admits that I threw his brother to the ground, and the U.S. attorney kept trying to get him to say about a beating. And she kept saying, well, what happened after your brother was taken to the ground? And the response by his brother was, he was put into the police car and taken away, never mentioning anything about kicking or beating.
Okay, so that was just a little extra flair that was added by the prosecution. So the other 3 officers that were involved, what were they? I know you're not, you actually were not involved in any of the. These are separate incidents, right?
Yeah, because I was charged as a conspiracy. I'm responsible for everything anyone in the conspiracy does, whether I was off duty at home with my family or working.
Sure, I get it. Just so listeners can understand, it wasn't one incident that led to all 4 of you being charged. These were separate incidents, and the reason the government alleged the conspiracy is so they could sweep you all into it together.
Correct.
So,
I believe it was easier for them to prosecute it, and they were hoping to get a conviction by being able to tell a story and put a bunch of stuff together.
It makes it a lot easier to do that. So what were as to the other 3 officers, I just want to kind of let listeners understand the nature of this case. So these were not, even the allegations, even if you thought they were true, were not very serious allegations.
No, things that would involve.
Like, what were they? What were the other allegations, just in a general way? Like, I know you weren't present for any of this stuff, but.
So during reading grand jury and testimony and hearing what the government said, like Sergeant John Miller, his was a drunk drug user that was involved in some kind of altercation. He fled from police. After they ended up arresting him, he was still fighting and kind of being uncooperative. One of the officers had him restrained, and he was kind of still flailing around while he was handcuffed, making threats towards officers. And John Miller gave him a half-speed jab to the chest and told him to knock it the F off.
And that led to federal criminal prosecution.
I've never heard of something like that being charged federally. That sounds, I don't know police internal affairs, but it sounds like something that could have been rectified with retraining or suspension.
You'd have a really hard time finding it.
It's barely a misdemeanor breach of peace on the state level or assault 3rd degree.
So how about Jason Zullo? What was he alleged and ultimately, convicted of doing?
Jason Zullo was involved with a dangerous police pursuit of a motorcycle with a multiple-time convicted felon in and out of prison his entire life, multiple fleeings from police, heavy drug user, thefts, all sorts of crimes. Jason Zullo was chasing this motorcycle, and from what I've read from witnesses, that at some point the suspect slammed on the brakes of the motorcycle, and Officer Zullo's police cruiser came into contact with the back of the motorcycle. The suspect didn't crash. He again accelerated, took off. He ended up getting boxed in somewhere and dumped the motorcycle with him and a passenger on the back. So Officer Zullo was convicted of not including the motorcycle coming into contact with the police cruiser in his probable cause police report. Probable cause police reports are supposed to include only information pertinent to the arrest of the suspect. If anyone was going to do an accident report between the collision of the motorcycle and the cruiser, it was supposed to be a supervisor. No police report was filed because the supervisor did not find any damage on the motorcycle or on the police car.
So it's basically a non-event. It's not an important fact to consider, especially in a probable cause report, where, as you said, the purpose of it is just to include actions taken by the defendant that support the charge, right? So it's
Correct.
not incidental things like, oh, and my police cruiser came into contact, especially if there's no damage and nobody's hurt. It's just not something that should be there. But that was the basis for the charge. Also, this whole investigation was based on allegations of racial profiling, right?
Yes.
Well, the case involving Jason Zullo, at least, and maybe in some of these other allegations, it wasn't even like that was just that was not.
He was a white Hispanic descent, a male.
Okay. How about the other, I know the person that you were involved in was of Hispanic descent. Were all of the people that were involved as, for lack of a better term, the person that the four of you were charged with interacting with in some way, either using excessive force or whatever, were they all Hispanic?
No. Sergeant Miller's was white. Officer Dave Cari's was white. And John Miller's was white.
So
non-Hispanic.
So this massive federal investigation based on racial profiling, actually, they couldn't even find interactions between you officers and members of the Latino community, which is who they say you were profiling. They couldn't even find anything.
No.
They could bring charges.
And they did an extensive investigation. They went into our police department and subpoenaed every single arrest report, every single arrest, motor vehicle infraction, or citation issued to every driver or every person we arrested during a 2-year period. They were looking for something to charge.
And then, I know from my experience, what they do is they start calling those people up or paying them a visit and interview them about the interaction. And they're looking for anything they can find that might support a criminal charge.
Correct. Sergeant John Miller's suspects, they couldn't find him to bring the report. This incident involving John Miller was brought up to the police department, and they investigated, and they took no action against Sergeant Miller. And the FBI went looking for this drug user, and they had a very hard time locating him because he was bouncing around house to house to try to charge John Miller.
The charges, assuming as charged by the feds, were true, not the conspiracy necessarily and discrimination charges, but the half-speed punch, the armbar, and the traffic accident tapping with the motorcycle. How would IA have handled those internally in a major department versus what they did in East Haven by the feds?
Well, I mean, when Internal Affairs gets notified, either because a citizen makes a complaint or there's a serious use of force or in any other way, they conduct an investigation. Usually, at a minimum, it's an administrative investigation, which is just trying to figure out where any of the rules of the department violated. Police departments have detailed policies. And so that's an administrative investigation, looks at it that way. But if there's anything that's potentially criminal, they involve usually a local prosecutor and brief the local prosecutor on what the investigation is uncovered. So the prosecutor, if they believe it's a crime, they could charge the officer. That's normally the way it plays out. And most of these things, and certainly the things that Dennis is outlining here and that I know happened in this case, were really more of an administrative nature, if anything. I mean, you look at the officers' training. Did they follow their training? That's the biggest thing. I mean, that's the biggest thing we find training lapses and sometimes policy violations. When I hear Dennis telling me about these various allegations, they strike me as if anything, these are administrative type things. These are things that can be dealt with in the discipline process where an officer might, be sent back for retraining, or they might, even potentially be suspended or something like that. That's not criminal, no jail, but just redirection.
So it sounds like the course of action taken here would be highly unusual, would be a fair description of the way that this was approached.
Oh, it's incredibly unusual. And it's because it wasn't investigated in real time because someone noticed the problem. In fact, the department, in some of these cases, the department had previously reviewed them, found that they were actually even consistent with policy. In some of these things, the local prosecutor had reviewed them, found that they were lawful. And it's only when you go years later, when you're actually looking for some other external motivation, you're looking to charge a cop with a crime or get a cop convicted of a crime, that you grasp at things and try to make them into something that they actually weren't. And that's what from the moment I heard about this case, that's the way I saw it.
Well, that was part one, and it's going to, take a few turns if you can tune in to our next episode, part 2, with Officer Spaulding and the East Haven 4 saga. There's a lot more to this story, and we're going to go into it. So make sure you tune into the next episode. And I want to remind you to subscribe across platforms. And we've gotten such great feedback from all of you. And we want you to tune in next week. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.